It is Thursday, March 5th, 4 p.m. in Washington, D.C. I'm Ben Swan, and this is RT America. Welcome to our special coverage of the origins of ISIS. ISIS, the most brutally violent terror group in modern history, and a year ago, you'd never even heard of them. That's because ISIS isn't an old terror group. They are newly formed, newly armed, and newly funded. Today, we're going to talk about where this group comes from, how they are sustained, and where they're headed next. So where to begin? Well, the story of ISIS actually begins in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein. As a war effort, it didn't take much, but the cost was high. The U.S. not only removed Hussein from power, but we also destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure. We dismantled and then attempted to rebuild the Iraqi army. More on that in a minute. We also helped to install a government that was not responsive to the people. We imprisoned thousands of men who we deemed as radicals, giving them access to each other. And most importantly, we left a destabilized, weak country with destroyed infrastructure and huge amounts of American military gear. So where does ISIS come into all of this? Well, ISIS actually formed as a small insurgent group in Iraq in 2006. And while they tried to create problems for the U.S. military, they had no money and no real ability to recruit. It wasn't until 2009 that ISIS shifted its focus from Iraq, where it was largely unsuccessful in developing a foothold, and focused on Syria. By 2011, the Syrian civil war was getting underway, and ISIS had its chance. In June of 2013, a northern general for the Free Syrian Army spoke out on Al Jazeera, Qatar, and stated that if international forces did not send weapons, the rebels attempting to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would lose their war within a month. Well, within just a matter of weeks of that Syrian general making his plea for international help, the U.S., the Saudis, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel began providing weapons, training, and money to the so-called rebel groups like the Free Syrian Army. By September of 2013, American media outlets began reporting that weapons were being given to Syrian rebels. CNN reported that while the weapons were not American-made, they were funded and organized by the CIA. And this is where things all fell apart. Within less than 1 year after the U.S. supplied those Syrian so-called freedom fighters with weapons, those weapons ended up in the hands of ISIS fighters. In fact, American media also began to report that the Free Syrian Army had fighters defecting from their ranks and joining with ISIS. By the time ISIS began to make headlines, President Obama himself acted as if ISIS were nothing to be worried about.
We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
The United States will not pursue military options that support one sect inside of Iraq at the expense of another. There's no military solution inside of Iraq, certainly not one that is led by the United States.
I think it's fair to say that their extreme ideology poses a medium and long-term threat. There are a lot of groups out there that probably have more advanced immediate plans directed against the United States that we have to be on constant guard for.
I've directed our military to take targeted strikes against ISIL terrorist convoys should they move toward the city. We intend to stay vigilant and take action if these terrorist forces threaten our personnel or facilities anywhere in Iraq.
Well, by June of 2014, ISIS had emerged, going from a no-name group in Syria to crossing back over the border and into Iraq. Well, one of the reasons why ISIS was able to become so powerful so quickly was because of their ability to grab up U.S. military gear. We'll talk about that in a minute, but also because of the stunning amount of wealth that they've been accumulating, most of that coming from seizing oil fields in Iraq and in Syria. To combat that, the U.S. has been conducting airstrikes to destroy those fields, a policy that if you step back and think ahead more than 5 minutes doesn't make a lot of sense. Because when ISIS is defeated, and eventually they will be, the country's infrastructure is already destroyed. Earlier, I spoke with Maren Katusa, the chief energy investment strategist at Casey Research, and I began by asking him why there are no sanctions against oil being sold by ISIS.
Well, essentially, it's what we call in the black market. So there's a buyer that'll buy it at a big discount. This has been going on for decades, and essentially you can't control such items. At the same item, you know, you're looking at ISIS attacked and shut down on the 11 fields, so you're looking at about 400,000 barrels a day that has come offline. So yes, the markets are making a big deal, but considering we did produce 92 million, it's not that big of a deal in the big picture.
So you're saying it's impossible to be able to sanction these countries that are purchasing oil from ISIS?
Exactly, because they'll never admit to it, and that's the problem there.
Okay, let me ask you this. When we have a U.S. policy that says, well, instead of sanctioning, because obviously we can't do that, let's blow up the oil fields, does that make any sense? Because as I talk to people about this, they'll say, when you do that, eventually ISIS will be out of power. And when they are, you've left destroyed infrastructure behind.
Exactly, and then the question is what's next after ISIS and who's created ISIS? So that's just a horrible policy. But even when you look at the Americans' foreign policy of sanctions against Russia, why is nobody talking about the fact that Exxon, which is America's largest oil company, has gone from 11 million acres in Russia to over 60 million acres? And Exxon, which is America's company, has 300% more acreage in Russia than they have in America. But yet this is all during the last year that they've increased over 50 million acres of exposure in Russia. But I thought there were sanctions here. So for the Americans to start running around the world to regulate everyone else, how about they regulate themselves?
Okay, well, I think it's a good point. Again, when we talk about these oil fields, so if you have infrastructure, I'm going to go back for a second. If we have infrastructure that's destroyed, so in Syria, we have airstrikes against oil fields. You're going to blow up the oil fields, which you can argue there's a whole other strategy there, that you're not really trying to destroy ISIS's funding and source of revenue. You're actually trying to destroy Assad's oil fields and collapse his government. But if you're going to destroy those, how long does it take to get those back online and rebuilt? What does that process look like?
So, for example, let's take Kuwait. So when I went to Kuwait and you look at what Saddam did, the scorched earth policy, you can shut down these wells and let's just say you scorch them and you break down the pipeline. Depending on how bad you've demolished the infrastructure, you can get it back going within 90 to 120 days, depending. So when I went to Iraq with Doug Casey, the big risk there were the pipelines, and that's what was always being attacked. But realistically, the pipelines could be back and up and running within 30 days. So it really depends on where the infrastructure is. Is it a port, or is it the transport? Is it a facility which cleanses the oil and transports it? So it all depends on what. But essentially, within 120 days on the on-site facilities, you can fix them up. Now, if it's a port issue, that's a big difference, and that could take up to 6 months to get going again.
Because of course the ability to transport oil is different from the ability to get it up out of the ground.
Exactly.
All right, Marin Katus, author of The Colder War and with Casey Research, thanks so much for your insight.
My pleasure.
And of course, as of today, ISIS still has those oil fields in Syria and northern Iraq in their pockets. And as a result of that, they are being called the best funded terrorist organization that the U.S. has ever confronted. And not surprisingly, much of that funding comes from oil, but not all of it. RT's Amira David takes a closer look at the resource that is financing the terror.
Oil has been one of the most difficult resources to track in the struggle against ISIS. But the latest reports estimate that the terror group is making over $1 million a day from producing and smuggling the resource. That's several $million a week. And believe it or not, before September, the revenue stream was a lot higher than that. According to a recent report put out by the Financial Action Task Force, an international agency that follows terror financing, airstrikes against the group's oil infrastructure have brought that revenue down significantly. However, oil is still a huge financial booster for the terror group's operations. Keep in mind, ISIS now controls broad swaths of land in Iraq and Syria and oversees an estimated 6 million people. Because of that large population, there's a huge demand for oil within the region, fuel for cars, generators, and of course businesses. In fact, much of that oil is purchased by the very residents it oversees. But the remaining portion, according to that report, comes from sales made through smuggling the resource. That's where it gets a bit tricky. ISIS is paid mostly in cash for the oil it sells, making the transactions very, very hard to track. Several past reports have suggested that the oil is being smuggled into neighboring countries, including Syria, Turkey, Iran, and even Jordan. In a November Guardian report, Iraqi intelligence officials said that ISIS was using the Anbar province, which shares a border with Jordan, as a major smuggling hub. Considering all the oil fields ISIS controls, along with the roads surrounding them, it doesn't come as a huge surprise, but it has fueled a lot of questions over whether the U.S. and its allies can or will do anything to crack down on those purchasing the oil, thereby further straining the group's financial supply. Reporting in Washington, Amira David, RT.
Of course, the latest battleground for ISIS is in the northern African country of Libya. Only weeks ago, more than 20 Egyptian Coptic Christians were beheaded in Libya by ISIS fighters, a situation that, like Iraq, was made ripe for ISIS through the NATO overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. Senator Rand Paul talked about this issue at CPAC last week.
When I voted against arming the Islamic rebels in Syria, I warned that these arms might end up in the hands of jihadists, and that one day we might be forced to go back to fight against our own weapons. Within a year, that prediction came true. Without question, we must now defend ourselves and American interests from this barbarous aberration. But it troubles me that we must now fight against our own weapons. In the Middle East, one form of tyranny often replaces another. When secular despots are overthrown, chaos ensues and radical Islam grows stronger. Hillary's war in Libya is a perfect example. Hillary's war made us less safe. Libya is less stable, and radical jihadists run amok. They swim in our swimming pool. Hillary's war in Libya allowed thousands of surface-to-air missiles to fall into the hands of radical Islamists.
Well, I spoke earlier with RT correspondent Lizzie Phelan from Berlin, and I asked her about this latest push by ISIS to take Libyan oil fields. We've been talking today about the fact that throughout Iraq, the situation there, because of the destabilizing of that country, because of the destabilizing of the government, completely changed the situation there and really made the ground ripe for ISIS. It seems like Libya is a very similar situation. How could everyone overlook this growing threat of ISIS and also this organization that nobody had heard of? Now that we've seen them take Iraq, parts of Syria, isn't Libya just the perfect breeding ground for them to move into as their next phase?
Well, absolutely. 4 years ago, in 2011, when the uprising against the former Libyan government began, there was, you could argue, a huge missed opportunity in terms of the coverage, because while there was back-to-back coverage of the peaceful demonstrations against the former Libyan government, there were also at the very same time credible reports coming out of armed groups who were attacking police stations and military barracks, and thousands of people being released from jails. Now, it was well known at the time that inside Libyan jails there were many fighters who were members of the so-called Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, who were an Al-Qaeda affiliated group. So reports that these fighters left the jails and then went on to form some of the most effective fighting forces amongst the rebels who were armed and financed by the NATO powers. And of course, one of the most notorious members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group that went on to lead one of the battalions against the former Libyan government was a man called Abdel Hakim Belhaj, who then went on to be the military commander of Tripoli after the fall of the Libyan government. This man was endorsed by the NATO powers as the military commander of Tripoli, despite the fact that he had these connections to an Al-Qaeda affiliated group. But that was very much kind of dismissed at the time. But in the last few days, we've seen unconfirmed reports that an unnamed US intelligence official has told Fox News that this man, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, is in fact the leader of ISIS. Now, as I said, these reports are unconfirmed, but if they do emerge to be true, then this would be very, very embarrassing to the NATO powers, that a man that they armed and enabled to come to the position that he's in today is in fact leading one of the most feared groups in the world today.
And that is, I think, at the root of it, really the core of the problem here. You've covered Libya and the Middle East extensively over the last several years. We've watched this happen time and time again. Secular powers in place, uprooted by NATO, uprooted by the U.S., only to have these Islamic radical groups now taking over and brutal groups such as ISIS. So again, how did we get here? Well, let's go back to the very beginning, because when ISIS was making that march back from Syria and into Iraq, when they got into Iraq, they found that the Iraqi army was no challenge for them, no resistance at all. Again, this is an army trained by the U.S. and left with tens of thousands of military vehicles, Bearcats, tanks, MRAPs, armored vehicles, and weapons, all of which were easily taken by ISIS. So why did the Iraqi army fail so miserably? RT correspondent Manuel Rapolo has that part of the story.
For many, it came as a shock when the Iraqi army, backed and well armed by the United States, folded to the invading forces of the Islamic State, or ISIS. But why? How could an entire army, funded at a cost of $25 billion, shouldered by U.S. taxpayers, simply fold to a relatively unknown group of Islamic militants? Simple answer is that it's really not that simple. In fact, it's a whole host of factors that set up Iraq's army to fail from the start. Consider that the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein was entirely disbanded in 2003 following the American invasion of Iraq. With the army gone, there was no more hierarchy, no more experienced generals or experienced soldiers like those that fought in the Iran-Iraq war to take control of securing Iraq when the U.S. finally pulled its forces from the country. Of course, there's also the countless allegations of corruption within the government of Nouri al-Maliki, where even U.S. government workers in Iraq knew how fragile Iraqi politics were before handing over control of the country to national security forces. One former military advisor told Al Jazeera in 2014 that, quote, the Maliki government has spent a lot of time over the past 5 years alienating the Sunnis, and that's not how you create an effective security force that has high morale. It was a little bit of a rotten edifice to begin with. And even before the Islamic State's sprawl across Iraq and into Syria, we can point to the countless headlines that we kept seeing week after week. First, it was that ISIS had taken over one of the largest dams in Iraq, threatening to flood major cities. Then it was a bank robbery where bandit militants made off with hundreds of millions of dollars. Then, of course, was the most troubling realization of all, that as the Iraqi army retreated and conceded, countless U.S. weapons fell into the hands of the Islamic State. M16s, AK-47s, rocket launchers, tanks, and armored vehicles, all of which are now being used by the very people the U.S. is officially at war with. Today, it's been reported that the Iraqi army is at best half the size that it was when the U.S. pulled out of the country, reigniting debate here in Washington over whether or not U.S. forces will once again step in. Manuel Rapolo, RT Studios, Washington.
So there you have it. The Iraqi military simply fell apart when faced by ISIS, and in doing so, as Manuel mentioned, turned over so much military equipment to the group. How much are we talking about? Well, take this into consideration. The U.S. military left in Iraq about 4 million pieces of equipment valued at $580 million. However, the military said that they were saving $1 billion in shipping costs by not bringing it back to the States. And yet that's not much of a savings when we're now sending $500 million to the FSA to fight ISIS. So here we are. ISIS has control of portions of Syria and northern Iraq. What do we do about them? What should the role of the U.S. be in taking on ISIS?
Because we created the mess. But the problem is, if you look at U.S. policy and what we've done so far in our nation-building campaign to first oust Saddam and then later Egypt, Mubarak, and then later Libya and Syria, we see that in every single case what we've done is create massive power vacuums. And as you've correctly reported on over the course of your piece here, what you've really created is the necessity of a U.S. military in order to provide stability, because there is no solid, stable foundation there. And it doesn't matter how long you're there. We were in 10 years in Iraq. It doesn't matter how long you're there. As soon as you pull out, as soon as you pull back, unless you're going to take Iraq as a U.S. province, as soon as you pull out, you're going to see these, these militants come back in to try and secure power.
Saddam Hussein was not a good leader, certainly. Muammar Gaddafi was not a good leader in Libya. Both were secular leaders in charge of functioning societies, and that's something that I think we tend to forget, especially in a post-Iraq war era, post-Libya era, is that we look back as if those nations were not functioning. They were functioning societies. That is no longer the case after U.S. military intervention. Is that what creates the opportunity for ISIS in what we've seen in the last year or so?
Well, absolutely. You got to ask yourself the question, how did the evil dictators become evil dictators? Well, they became the evil dictator in a now functioning and stable country because they were able to fend off all of the other evil potential dictators that weren't able to come to power because they were the most brutal and the most successful at achieving and controlling the populace. And so to suggest that somehow you're going to turn that over and you're going to have a bunch of people who are going to come in and we're going to establish a functional republic in Iraq Iraq or in Egypt, and that these guys we're going to have an Arab Spring and everybody's going to love freedom and liberty in those parts of the world. That's not the way it works there. And the idea that you're going to do that is really a failure of U.S. policy, a massive failure and a massive misunderstanding of the way the world actually works and the way the Middle East is structured.
When you say the way that the world actually works, I'm going to ask you something here, and it's a little difficult to find words for because people will hear you start to say it and then they think it's, you know, it seems strange. But our way of doing warfare today is so different than in empires past and leading nations around the world in the past, in which if you went to war and you fought with another nation, you would conquer it and you would keep it. You would actually take ownership of it. But we don't have a policy of that anymore. And I'm not advocating for that policy, but at least that makes more sense than going in and blowing up a country, basically destroying the infrastructure, toppling the government, and then leaving. It's almost as if we're no longer in a state of imperialism, but in a state of constant war. Am I getting that incorrect?
No, you're absolutely correct. And you've got people in Washington like John McCain who advocate this sort of thing. There's never a war that doesn't need to be fought. There's never democracy that doesn't need to be spread. The problem is they're terrible at it. If Iraq wasn't a big enough education for us, then Egypt should have been. And if Egypt wasn't, Libya should have been. And if Libya wasn't, Syria should have been. Every time we try this is a disaster. And now, of course, U.S. policy is there's never a question of whether we should go at all, whether we should just turn around and go home and say, look, we've screwed things up enough here. Let's go home and just let this place sort itself out. No, the question is always, the debate is always, well, should we just bomb them or should we send ground troops back in? What's the answer? To send ground troops back in for another 10 years? Until what? When we decide to pull out, what do you think is going to happen? There is no good solution here. We've wrecked this entire thing. And the only suitable solution is just to simply withdraw and say, look, we've got to let whatever happens, happens, because we've been an utter failure in our attempt to spread democracy to the Middle East.
When you say that we've wrecked this entire thing, though, I mean, the reality is when we went into Iraq in the first place, we went in there under the auspices of a lie. The idea that Saddam Hussein was somehow connected to 9/11, which we knew that he was not, also connected to the idea that Saddam Hussein was harboring and creating a safe haven for al-Qaeda, which he was not, yes, or that he had weapons of mass destruction, which it turned out he did not. In fact, the only chemical weapons that we dug up during the Iraq War were the ones that we provided to Saddam to fight the Iranians in 1980. So at some point, are we in a position where, because the whole thing started from this false pretense that there is no good answer because the entire thing is based upon fallacy and untrue arguments?
When you base your doctrine around a philosophy of preemption, keep in mind we're doing the exact same thing with Iran now. Netanyahu was just in town trying to convince America to do a preemptive war and preemptive strikes against Iran. So we're trying to continue this vicious cycle. And when you have a doctrine of preemption, what you do is create a massive mess, because you're exactly right. The rules that we use, the rationale we use to justify going to Iraq turned out to be faulty. And the fact of the matter is that any war of preemption and aggression is a philosophy of tyrants. And I don't think that's what America is. I don't think that's what America wants to be. And even if we did want to be that, just look at the results. The results speak for themselves.
Now, I want to ask you finally here, we're short on time, but you yourself have served honorably in our military. So many thousands of men and women have, tens of thousands who have served in Iraq, they've served in Afghanistan, and thousands more who have not come home from those wars. At what point do we as the American people start demanding responsibility, if for no other reason than to say, why are we sending our sons and daughters, fathers and mothers off to these wars to fight against groups and then arming the next generation of fighters who will ultimately claim American lives as well? Last word on that.
That's always been my complaint, is you don't send our men and women to die. You don't waste our blood and our coin when America is not directly at risk. And there's no doubt that ISIS is a threat to the Middle East. There's no doubt that Islamic terrorism is a threat to the United States and our way of life. But ISIS is not a direct threat to the United States. And to send our young boys and our young women there to die seems senseless to me, especially when there is no clear plan on how you're going to achieve victory.
And that is exactly the problem. Jason Stapleton, former U.S. Special Operations Marine, host of the Jason Stapleton program. Thanks so much.
Thank you.